Welcome everyone to this very special live webinar that Gulf Business is hosting in association with cybersecurity company SentinelOne. Ramadan Kareem, hope everyone is staying safe right now. Most of you I know are working out of home. The pandemic has completely changed things for all of us. Remote working across the world, and it has thrown a host of different challenges. And I'm sure a lot of parents in the group will agree with me that some of those challenges are different, interesting stories that you'll probably have to share on experiences that you're going through. But I think one area that has been of particular concern is cybersecurity. We've seen, I'm guessing many of you, your companies may have seen some kind of a security breach. It could have been a malware attack, it could have been a spam email, or something very serious in recent weeks. Now, what a lot of cybersecurity companies, both locally and globally, are telling us are that many of these attacks are targeted at the fear that a lot of us are facing. We are vulnerable right now, we're uncertain about what's coming up, so we are facing a lot of fear and they're targeting that fear, the malware attacks that we are seeing right now. So in such a situation, how do we go forward? Now, a lot of companies do have strong security defense systems in place, but is that enough? The current threat landscape is changing by the minute, if not by the day, or by the second, actually, I think I should say. So how do companies keep up? One, we have limited resources. Two, we are a distributed workforce right now. And three, we're seeing massive information flows. So how do we keep secure in such a situation? The good thing is that we have a lot of tools available to us, and to give us more understanding on how we can go forward, we have with us today Tietze. He is the Director of Security Strategy, Europe, Middle East, and Africa at SentinelOne. He's served in senior technical and management roles for several global IT and consultancy organizations. He's been a trusted advisor to a lot of his clients. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jan.
Thank you very much for having me.
Just before we start the discussion, a quick reminder of the format and all the facilities that we have. You have a Q&A, all of us have a Q&A option at the bottom, so you can use that. Any questions that you have during the session, feel free to send those. We have dedicated Q&A time at the end, so we'll address those questions. I'll also see if in between the session we can address them. Also, at the end, during the Q&A time, there is a cute hi option there, raise your hand option. So if you just press that, I can unmute you and you can ask your question directly to Jan. You can use the chat network, the chat feature to talk with everybody else, network with the others. Please ensure you follow us on social media at Gulf Business on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and at Gulf Business Magazine on Instagram. Any feedback you have, please feel free to let us know. On Facebook, we'll have the story up, so any comments, any further questions you have, we can always get back to you. Now, that out of the way, let's bring Jan in. Thank you so much once again for joining us, Jan. First question is, now I know this is a basic one, with remote working, we do understand cybersecurity is a concern, but how big of a concern is it in reality?
So I think remote working is different across the regions in the globe. When you look at Europe, there are large parts of Europe that have a very high presence culture. The same is true for parts of the Middle East. In Europe, on average, it's 5% of the workforce that work remotely. And right now, in Germany, where it's normally exactly 5%, we're at about 60% of the workforce being remotely. So that's a significant increase. In some regions, it's as much as a 20-fold increase. And that affects every organization individually, because they are now at maybe 10, maybe 20 times the risk that they had before from users that are basically working from very hostile environments. And by hostile, I mean people's homes that may not feel hostile, but it's basically an unmanaged network where often you have a shared environment where you have kids on the same network and you don't know what they're doing online. You have questionable device choices that have been made, like that $20 webcam that was purchased 5 years ago that's still working well for surveillance purposes. But that can be an entrance into that network. And that is now effectively your perimeter. Like we've been talking about the perimeter dissolving for years, but it became a very sudden reality as we had these lockdowns coming to individual nations and people then starting to work from home much more. And that, as you said, at a time when people have heightened sensitivities. Like if you send them an email that says, hey, here's important information about COVID-19, and it's targeted to in your area, or you're preying on their sociable instincts, asking for contributions to charities, maybe there's a lot of fake charities going on at the moment, then they are much more likely to let down their critical thinking, and they may just click on almost anything. And I think that's a big risk. So there's the infrastructural side, there's a social side that contributes to the risk. And we don't know for how long this situation is going to continue. So it may very well be a new normal that we have to adjust to, and that we need to find a way to best address.
So in this new normal, how do you go about hunting and finding where these attacks are coming from? What is the process like? Take us through it.
So I'll go into the hunting process in more detail in my presentation, but generally hunting is not a responsive activity where you already know what's going on, but you operate based on a hypothesis, and that hypothesis could be we are already compromised. That's a typical compromise or hypothesis, or we will face attacks. And then you require visibility, because the next thing you do is you actually start researching that hypothesis and find supporting evidence. You're actually not looking for contradicting, only for supporting evidence. And that's difficult to do for a remote workforce if you're not equipped to have the visibility for users that are not working on premise. So it starts with actually having the capability. Even if you have the people in place, what used to be maybe 5% of your workforce is now a critical major portion of it. And if you're not equipped to have the insight there for these relatively poorly connected devices, then you will have a hard time performing threat hunting on those devices and having that required visibility.
But what you just mentioned, going with that, how do you ensure when you have such a distributed workforce, you don't have that kind of control? So how can companies get that level of control? Is it even possible to ensure that the landscape is secure as possible?
So there are things you can do and there are things you can't do. I mean, it's not going to be likely that you will be able to reform the networks of your end users, the home networks, and make them professional IT staff to maintain those networks and the safety and security of them. And their habits of what they will consume on those networks, what they will do with it, will differ from what they do on a corporate network anyway. And you can't really restrict that. You will have to give them the ability to use their network for personal purposes. And in some cases, even their devices, like you will have devices that used to be a personal device and that now all of a sudden are being used for remote access, simply because the level of preparedness was never for 100% of my people working remotely.
Right.
So that's the aspect that you will likely have to just accept, but you can mitigate that risk. And you can mitigate that risk by introducing security controls that are able to work in a cloud-first, remote-first landscape, that do not rely on that connection to a head office, that do not rely on a VPN connection, so that users that are not on VPNs, maybe because all they need to do is have a Zoom session, and I heard that recently, like restrictions on networks in the Middle East have been lifted, so that that's possible without VPNing into corporate. So they're also less likely to go through the hassle of doing like two-factor auth, connecting to a corporate VPN. So introducing agents that work regardless of whether a device is domain joined, that work regardless of whether it has connectivity to your network at the moment, and that do not put a burden on you to deploy, like having to scale horizontally at the moment is difficult as you cannot access your data center physically. It's difficult to bring out new services. So the more you can rely on consuming that from a cloud, the better at the moment, especially at the moment, because then it makes it possible for you to get that benefit of scale and visibility regardless of connectivity.
Do you have a lot of options available in the regional market where right now a company realizes that, okay, this is what we have to do, go to the cloud? Are there options available in the market which can take charge at the go?
I mean, yes, so I can talk about our case specifically, we offer both a cloud as well as an on-prem option. So we have both deployment models. But in a situation like this one, it's not super likely that a company will start to just deploy something new to on-prem and go through the whole process and then setting up firewall rules and all of the associated things. And then in terms of existing security infrastructure, there are much more basic problems that need to be taken care of as well. Like a lot of the time, we work under the assumption that users will connect to the office from time to time so that their device can be patched, so that they can get the latest versions of applications. And very often that won't work if they don't at least VPN in for prolonged periods of time. So we're going to see an increase in devices that are not patched, even though there are corporate devices, and that creates additional risks. So getting that in order should be another priority. And that's stuff you already own. That's not even something new that you would introduce, but just making sure that you have existing controls for patch management, for update management, for application deployment, for group policy management in place, so that they can work in a scenario where users do not come to the office for many weeks. That's a challenge in itself, but something that needs to be resolved.
Jan, we just have a question that's come in. This is from Srinivasan Parthasarthi. Thanks for your question, Srinivasan. He says, hi guys, my query is if I have a secure network at work and give people access via apps like AnyDesk, either free or the paid version, does that still compromise my work network? We use Google Cloud as well as at work.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know what AnyDesk is. I assume that it's a remote control software similar to TeamViewer and similar softwares that you can remote into your devices. Is that correct?
Let's ask Srinivasan.
Okay. Confirmed. So yes. So you're definitely putting your devices at risk and your networks at risk, because the endpoint is the threat vector to enter into your network. And end user devices, like if they're coming in from a personal device, are not secure. That means you can assume that some of those will be, some of the time, under the control of an attacker, which means that they can get access to any session on it, any credential on it, that they can connect through AnyDesk running on the device. You know, people do leave their computer, they leave the computer running, and with the credentials, they can then remote in, or they can use an existing session. And that's actually not that difficult, and there have been compromises at a larger scale for remote desktop-based services before. So not just remote desktop itself, but there have been for these broker-type services where you go into a site on the internet that then connects back to your work desk, and at significant scale. So while that helps you with one aspect, it helps you with giving them access to their regular work environments, but it doesn't necessarily help you with that security aspect. All of the devices are completely updated and patched. That's great. That still doesn't mean they don't have any vulnerabilities. But if they're managed devices, and if you can ensure that they have as little attack surface as possible, that's of course best cyber hygiene, and definitely recommended.
Yeah, now let's go with the assumption that all of us are going to get attacked at some point or the other. So how do we go about tracing these attacks, and what can we do next?
So tracing attacks. And what can we do next? I'm going to show in my presentation. I think that a lot of companies basically lack the insight to be able to figure out whether there is an attacker already in their environment. So figuring out whether you're already compromised, whether there is command and control communication in your environment, and doing that holistically across both local endpoints as well as remote workers, as well as cloud applications like Kubernetes and containers. That's a challenge. And very often you don't have that visibility in one system. So you may have some of that visibility, but it's spread around a lot of different silos. And then it becomes very hard to manage, and it becomes very hard to connect the dots. I think that's a big challenge. And that is one of the things that I think going out of this crisis, companies are going to start to address as one of the big learnings.
There's another question that's coming from Jishnu. If you are still working from home, we don't have security devices like firewalls. So could there be a threat when they're connected to the cloud? Isn't it? Is his question, which I'm guessing you've already said, yes, there is the threat.
Of course, there's a threat, because a lot of the filtering that you typically do in your corporate networks, like DNS-based filtering, so that you can take out known bad sites, known sites that are going to distribute malwares to them, especially related to phishing. These controls very often don't exist for home users. And even if you like add that to your corporate email, like if you use Google Cloud or some other cloud provider for email, there's likely some sort of anti-phishing control already in place. And let's just assume that that works perfectly well, which it never does. But if you assume that it does, they're still accessing their personal email on the same device. And they're still going about consuming a lot of other sites on that same device. So it's a different environment with different behavior from people. And I think what you're really seeing at the moment is companies getting a return on investment for cybersecurity awareness programs. Like if you had an information security awareness programs and you were educating your staff well and making them pass through exams that I know every person on the staff usually hates. But if you do that, I'm sure that you will see a significantly lower number of incidents as a result of people working from home because they apply more critical thinking skills about what they consume, how they consume it, on what devices they do, and to spot phishing attacks.
We'll keep some of the other questions for the last part of the program today. Jan, do you want to take us through the presentation of how do we go around the hunting process now?
Sure. Let me share my screen with you. That can take a moment. Let's see if it works well. You should be able to see my screen. Let me know if that's working. So I wanted to talk about the threat hunting challenge today. And Artie has already introduced myself, but because I can't be there in person, I had a slide in my deck that kind of introduces myself. My background is very technical. So I started out as a pen tester and a forensics consultant early in my career and fell in love with security. You could say that I pursued security when I was long before my work life. I was part of the phone phreaking community, which in the mid-90s got free calls around the world, basically. And then I progressed through various roles into C-level roles, like a chief technology officer for AvePoint and for NordCloud, and then chief information officer. So I see the challenge from both the side of a consultant coming into an organization, typically having a task of fixing something or fixing an aspect of it, as well as the needs and constraints of the other side, on the customer side. And I love what I'm doing. I've been doing it for a while. I wouldn't trade it in for any other job. So I hope that some of that transpires throughout the talk today. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to pass them, and Artie may pass them on even during the day. Quick words about SentinelOne. This is the only slide about SentinelOne, the company. We were founded in 2013, headquartered in Mountain View, have almost $500 million of funding, more than 500 employees. 3 of the Fortune 10 are already customers of ours. We have more than 3,000 customers in total. And we specialize in protecting endpoints, and we protect them regardless of connectivity and regardless of whether a human looks at the data that's coming in from it. And we do it in a way that it doesn't depend much on knowledge about what attacks to expect. And that's pretty unique. And we use artificial intelligence and machine learning for that. But we also use a lot of traditional security controls in the same product. And I think we're all in agreement about why we're here. We're here because cybersecurity is an important problem to address. When we look at the United States, where we have good numbers, in 2019 alone, breaches, and by breach I mean an incident that results in the confirmed disclosure of, for instance, personally identifiable data to an unauthorized party, so there's a legal impact to the organization, have caused about 16 billion in damages. And incidents, so that's whenever you lose security control of an asset. So you could lose control of a device, so you, in the best case, may need to re-image it, or you may have something that impacts the availability of an application or the integrity of data or the confidentiality of data. The estimated reported number for that is 75 billion in 2019 alone. So it's a sizable problem for all of us, and every organization has incidents. Sometimes you meet that one person that says their organization hasn't had an incident. And you learn to have a little bit of compassion for organizations that say that, because it means they don't know. Then you have automated attacks and semi-automated attacks today. You have very fast and quickly evolving attacks, usually run with a profit motive. And that's a notable change from when I started in the industry 20 years ago. The profit motive wasn't very prevalent. And then you had threat actors like North Korea stepping up that have a very strong profit motive and that are doing both relatively commoditized automated attacks in the form of ransomware, as well as very sophisticated attacks, like attacks on the SWIFT banking network, that are slow, that are very individualized, that go undetected for a large amount of time in order to be able to act on objectives. So it's a different threat landscape, and in the threat landscapes, you have threats that will basically say, hello, here I am, that's ransomware, and you will have those that are really problematic and that cause lots of damage and that don't usually try to direct attention towards themselves. And I said a few words about knowledge before. So when you look at traditional security controls, very often they are based on doing some sort of reputation check. So looking up a hash of a file, whether it's known. When we looked at last year's total detections that we had, then more than 70% of the detections in our services had been unknown to reputation services across the industry. So that's a relatively large percentage that we could detect, but that were net new to the world. And that's part of that is because it's really easy to just take an existing file and make a trivial modification to it that doesn't change its functionality. And those you will still find using things like signatures. So even with more traditional security controls. But then you can also do more sophisticated attacks. Like when you look at just executables, and executables are like the most basic type of attack, like think of a Trojan installer, of a drive-by download of an executable. Then more than 70%, 77 of those were unknown to reputation services. And that's a little more sophisticated. And when you talk documents, then the level of sophistication that can go into creating something that looks net new can be very high, and more than 90% of the detections were unknown to reputation.
That's quite massive, isn't it, Jan?
It is very massive, and it's one of the reasons why campaigns like Emotet are so successful still. It's because of the way that they are able to basically bring the payload to the end user system and circumvent controls that are based on knowledge rather than behavior, like that are based on identifying something that's already known rather than looking at what it actually does in the environment that you executed it. Mm-hmm. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that knowledge-based controls, like I mentioned DNS filters earlier, are useful because they reduce the amount of noise that goes into your environment, and they reduce the amount of incidents that occur, but they're only part of what you need to be doing in order to solve the problem. And on the other side of the knowledge-based process of knowledge-based prevention, sits responding under the assumption that there has already been a compromise. And that's threat hunting. So threat hunting is a proactive process. It's driven by an analyst, so typically driven by a human, or basically always driven by a human, to search for attacker tactics, techniques, and procedures. We've heard the term probably in the context of the MITRE attack framework before, within a customer's environment, within an organization. So there's human creativity required. And what you don't see here is you don't see looking for IOCs. You don't see them looking for known hashes. You don't see them looking for something that just comes your way, because that's something that you can indeed automate. And that is something that antivirus and other controls are looking to do. But this is the process that requires human ingenuity to come up with a hypothesis and to then falsify or confirm that the hypothesis is true in your environment. That also means that the threat hunter's mindset is somewhat different from the mindset of a lot of the other good folks that we work with in the security industry. Like, there are a lot of ways to think about it, and there's definitely not one that's orthodox or correct. And that's also the case because it's a changing threat landscape. Like the attack actors, they do not keep their tactics forever. They do change over time. But there's a mindset that makes threat hunters successful, and there are commonalities, and I think I can illustrate them in the following a little bit. So you can think about some security controls, many security controls, similar to policemen. Policemen deter criminals, so they're a preventative security control, if you will. Like the firewall is a preventative security control because it only lets in some services, and it only lets you contact some services outside, so it reduces the attack surface. And that's a preventative control, like a policeman that is guarding a building, or that is guarding a politician or something. They're also a detective control, or a responsive control, a corrective control, but that's when there's already a dead body. So when you already know a crime has been committed, you have evidence of a crime, and you already know what to look for. You're not looking for something that is alien-shaped, but the work hypothesis for them is that the suspect is human, and in many societies that means it's going to be a male younger than 30 years old, like if it's a violent crime, for instance. So they have a good idea of what they need to look for, and they're very much bound by rules for how to investigate. There are like big legal texts that tell them what they can and cannot do. So it's difficult for them to like think outside the box and say, oh, what if we could survey every person that we have in the country and in every other country? Like they can't do that. That's not obtainable to them. So they work on little data. They are bound by rules. It's difficult for them to think and step outside the box. It's definitely something that we need. We need preventative security controls everywhere, but it's not a role model for threat hunting. For threat hunting, that doesn't get you something. The heroes in threat hunting look more like forensic accountants. And that's my idea of a superhero.
Right now, our superheroes are the ones in the hospital, aren't they?
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
The superheroes keep changing all the time.
Yes, at the moment, that's true. So within that little box of the world that I work in, the forensic accountant type is the superhero. Because to them, everyone is a potential suspect. There are no good people from their point of view. There's only data. And they need to look for tax evaders, for instance, and those change techniques all the time because they get caught from time to time. It's very public who gets caught and what they get caught for. So what they need to do is they need to analyze data. And they use the data not to find the crime or find the suspect that they need to prosecute, but they do it to generate suspicion that there was a crime. So they start off without knowing whether an organization is guilty of tax evasion or not.
Right.
So the mindset here is to generate the suspicion on the assumption that possibly there was a crime. And they do that by analyzing large amounts of data. So that's where the commonality in my mind is between forensic accounting and threat hunting. And I've tried to illustrate that by creating a pyramid model for threat hunting. So it starts with having large amounts of data available, where you collect and make available that data to hunt with. So when it's about cybersecurity, then you have lots of endpoints. You have servers, you have workstations, you will have cloud applications, and they all do something. Like they have behavior. So you collect information about their behavior. You can also collect information about things that is on their disk drives, about network connections that they have. But essentially, probably the most interesting class is behavior. So you record that and you create literally a huge haystack, terabytes, petabytes of data that you can then, in the second step, hypothesize what might be in it. So you have a haystack, and now you're defining what the needle could look like in the haystack. So you're looking for a particular signal. Signal is a term from the intelligence community. So you're looking for signal in the data. And then as you sift through the data, that of course you do with tools. You can't look at that manually. You get a lot of things that you find, and that you need to analyze, because not everything that conforms to your hypothesis will already be malicious in itself and be an incident in itself. Like you may be looking for something, and we're going to do that later, like look for communication to non-standard, like not the web, ports outside the organization. And you will assume that that doesn't happen in your organization. And then you find out that people use this instant messenger, you find out that they use QQ, you find out that they use WeChat, and all sorts of applications that use their own ports. So then you need to go back and refine your search, and you need to reprioritize your signal. So the signal needs to be tuned and changed so that only a significant set of data that is enough for you to work on and that sufficiently fits your hypothesis needs to be analyzed. And then you go to identify and prioritize what you found. So you will identify relevant signal and relevant incidents from that, and you will gather context for them. So understand more about what else happened. Like you have found maybe a connection to a non-standard port outside the organization that to you looks fishy. Now you want to understand what the process was that did it. What's the user that did it? And it might be different if it's the CEO from when it's Jennifer in the mailroom. There's different levels of significance to these two events. And then you will need to action and eventually respond to an incident, remediate what happened, and or collect forensic evidence, maybe possibly report it to authorities or to outside incident responder parties. But that's basically the process. And it's important to keep the hypothesis stage in mind, because that's really what requires the human creativity when you do threat hunting. And you can,
it's just a question, Jan. How long does this process take, would you say? Because this looks quite complicated by the time, and you know, analyzing, and like you mentioned, I think the hypothesis stage requires a fair bit of creativity and looking for the right signal. So how quick does this all have to happen within? Like how quickly does it have to happen?
So when you have sufficient tooling in place, it can take between seconds and days. When you don't have sufficient tooling in place, it depends on what you're trying to do. Like an organization that doesn't have the data to begin with, will need to decide how to get the data. Sometimes if you don't buy a solution that's already made for threat hunting, what people do is set up Elastic with Logstash and Kibana and make sure that they like collect logs from endpoint and use something like Sysmon that they roll out to Windows boxes, and then they need some other tool for Linux boxes, etc., to generate the data themselves. Like it's possible to do that using like open source means. It just means that you're investing a lot of time in creating the infrastructure, and then you don't end up with a specialized solution. There may still be value in that, but that will have an impact on how fast you can respond to a question. If you want to know, like you want to have a simple answer to like, do we have a service with a particular name in the organization? Or do we have scheduled tasks that call out to the internet? Like something like that. It's a relatively simple question. Then your tooling should be able to respond to such a hypothesis in a very short amount of time. Otherwise, you're going to spend more of your time creating the infrastructure for threat hunting rather than doing the job. And threat hunters should focus on the hypothesize, analyze, identify, and prioritize bit. That's what they're best at, and that's what they do.
Yes.
And then a term that you will hear very often, or that we all have heard very often, is indicators of compromise or threat intelligence. Like that's basically knowledge about what's currently going on or what has historically happened to organizations. Things like hashes and domain names and URLs and all sorts of things that can be brought to you as a feed. And then you can take the data that you already have, and then you can search the data for occurrences of these known indicators of problems. And these are useful because there's one question that you can easily answer with them, and that is, was I affected? Was my organization affected by X? So you can easily certify that, no, we didn't have WannaCry in this organization, or no, we haven't had instances of Ryuk in our organization. However, usually there's a limitation in how long back you can go in the data. Very often that's 7 days. That's not very long. With us, it's 30 days to a year. So you can have both 30 days or 1 year of data to sift through, which is an enormous volume. But still, there's a use in being able to do that, and it's also a commonly asked question by management, to be honest. Like, do we have this in our environment? Can you be sure? Yes, you can be sure if you use this, and that's what IOCs are really good for. They're not super great for identifying a targeted attack to your environment, because it's not super likely that they're just going to reuse all of the components that they used elsewhere, and even just a single bit change will turn a hash useless. So basically, there's no hypothesizing, there's no analytics and reasoning in this case, but you're consuming hypothesis and identification and the analytics and reasoning of others in a quality or semi-quality feed already. There's a space for that, there's a use for that, but it's not the same as threat hunting. It is, however, enabled by the same tools, because the data to begin with needs to be collected, and in order to be searchable, that is infrastructure that you need. And then there's traditional anti-malware controls like antivirus or next-gen antivirus in some cases that very often is based on prior knowledge. So it's based on prior knowledge in the form of signatures about bad binaries or bad scripts. Like there's in Windows, there's a feature in Defender and AMSI, the anti-malware scripting interface, that looks at the source code of PowerShell scripts, and that only looks for signatures in there. So it looks for signatures of known bad. So when you do like a Metasploit demonstration of an attack and you change the names of variables or you remove a bitness check, then you see that it goes through without problem. So that's still knowledge-based, and it's a good idea to have that, because it will reduce the number of incidents that you will have to go through and that your SOC will have to deal with by a certain degree, between 30 to 60% maybe, because you're getting rid of a lot of the noise. But it's, again, not related to threat hunting. It's just a removal of noise. It's a hygiene control, basically, from the SOC space. And what I like to do now is I'd like to take you through a practical example. So I would like to basically use our platform to show a practical example of threat hunting. I will first compromise a device. So I will take a computer that we'll call victim 1, and I will actually use Metasploit to establish persistence in this device, and then we'll look at indicators from that, and then we'll do threat hunting from there to give you an idea of how building up a hypothesis and confirming it can look like in practice. So I'll first open a Kali Linux box, which is a platform to perform pen testing exercises. And I'll open something called Interpreter, so I will be able to remote control a device from a maliciously crafted document. So the device will connect back to me here. Running this, and now we're listening for incoming connections from there. Notice the IP address. This IP address is a public IP address. I use IP addresses from North Korea for the purpose of my demonstration, so that we can easily distinguish them in many places. And of course, in reality, they're not just going to use their own IP addresses. And now I'll start the malicious document on my victim machine. And I need to enable editing. Maybe need to enable content. We know that this happens very often. This device is currently not set to protect itself, so it runs our agent, but the agent is configured to just let everything pass. So we will see the recording, but we are not going to actually respond, at least for now. So we're going to look at it as if it was something that goes under the hood and we don't notice it. So we go back here and we see that there's an interpreter session open now, which means that we have connected. So we can look at information from the system. We see that the name of the system is victim 1. We can look at what processes are running. And it's usually a good idea to not run as a separate process. So it's usually a good idea to like hide. So let's hide in OneDrive.exe, because that's already on this device. It's running as process 8416. That's the process ID. So we'll do what's called migrate. So our code will move from Word into the running instance of OneDrive. The Word instance closed itself, so it looks like an application crash to the end user. And now we have this hidden session. There's no indication to the end user that we have this session open and that we can control that system. Now what we can do is we can background this session, and then we can start
Jan,
becoming.
so now we're, sorry, I'm interrupting you, Jan, but so now we're looking at a hacker's machine.
Yes, we are. So right now we're looking at what a hacker is doing. And what we can now do is we can start bypassing, we can start bypassing the, sorry, I wasn't expecting the question at that moment. We can start bypassing local user account control so that we can become admin or system, so that we can assume the highest privileges on the system. So we'll execute that, and what we'll get then is we will get a new session. Once we run this, we will get a new session, a new interpreter session that has system privileges, which is a prerequisite for us to create a service and establish persistence so that we can have, regardless of when the user reboots the system, we will always get access. So we will continue to have access to the system. So there we are. We have that additional system session, and we'll background that one as well. And what we'll do now is we're going to establish a persistent access. And we'll do that as a service. And to be a little sneaky, what we're going to do is we're going to give a special name to the service. And we'll use SCCM cache helper as the name. So we'll just use a common name that IT probably expects here. And unless they deal with a software deployment, they may not notice that this name is strange. Could also change the name of the executable and change that to SCCM or CCM cache help.exe. And then look at the configuration to confirm and run it. And now we'll set up a system service on this device. And that system service has the full permissions, highest level of permissions on the system. And when the device reboots, it's going to connect back to our device here. So we have established a bridgehead in the organization that we can use to do anything and everything, basically, including like reading passwords and performing all of these other actions. So I'll do this. Before I do that, I'll interact with the first session and kill it, because we really don't need it anymore. And with the second session, and kill it. Actually, I'm not sure if the second session is the right one. So let me check that. Let's look at those sessions. Yeah, so the one we want to kill is actually session 2. And now we can just exit. And if we go back, the service is going to just connect to us and going to present us with a continuous access to this device. So I'm going through this just to show how a device could be compromised. So we're going to get a connection in a moment, and how we can maintain continuous access to it. And there it is. There's the continuous new access. So we will always get a session now. Whenever the device reboots, it's going to reinsert itself. And that's something that is kind of noisy and that will create a detection in our system. So I'm logging into our console to look at what just happened. I'm logging in using single sign-on in this case, but that's not super relevant to the subject that we're looking at. And I will change the scope so that we don't see the detection for my 400 colleagues, but that we're only going to see the ones in our system. And we see 2 detections. One is we see one for this document that we opened. And I'll open that because this shows you how the automatic detection capability of the system will help you. And that means things that you don't need to threat hunt for, but things that will be brought to your attention automatically. And then we'll take that as the basis for a threat hunt in a moment. So you see. One question. Sure.
Sorry. Okay. One question that's come up from an attendee is, when hacking the machine on the public network, when you say assuming the highest admin level, does this bypass the local security settings, such as limitations of the user?
Yes. So you're becoming system. As system, you can load any sort of code into the kernel that you want. There's no restrictions on what you can do. There are anti-tampering restrictions in many security agents that are of differing effectiveness, but generally when you're a system, you can do whatever you want to the system. Yeah. In many cases, that means you can very easily disable AV, for instance. So we see the detection here. We see that it's been correctly correlated to the root cause document. So there was a document at the beginning of our journey, and it's correlated that back to the root cause. And we see a number of indicators, like shellcode was detected. We see that an application has registered itself to become persistent via service. So what you see is you see a number of individual actions being grouped together. And that's important context for an analyst so that they can judge what's going on here and how relevant that is and how to best respond. We can look at a more visual representation of the network connections in this case. In my case, it's in the United States and in Korea. In the United States, because I egress my traffic over a VPN in the United States, so I don't get letters from my ISP all the time about having malware, spreading malware. And then I have North Korea, which is the recipient and the originator of our attacks here. And then we can look at the storyline of the attack. And that's really helpful to understand what occurred here. So you see that Winward had this document open. So you see that's the document it had open, exhibit 4.02, etc. And then you see an ordered graph of what the actions were that were taken, including all of the detailed data. And this is what we call a storyline or a true context. And we can act on that automatically, or I can now choose to act on it manually. Like I get this detection, I want to act on it, and my decision would be to remove the access. So I could like kill, which would just disrupt all of these running processes, or I could quarantine, which would take also the document and put it in quarantine, or I can choose to remediate or roll back, which will remove the service, for instance, that we established for persistence. And if I use rollback, then any documents or scripts, etc., that were changed in the process of the attack would also be rolled back to a state from a backup that's locally on the device in the form of a VSS snapshot. So I'll choose remediate, and then we'll watch what happens here to this. I choose remediate, and then we'll see what happens to this existing interpreter connection here. So we'll remediate, and it will send that command down to the agent, and the agent will then act. And there goes the interpreter session, and when we look at the desktop, it has removed the document, and the service has been removed from the system. So it's been a one-click response action, and it's only required a human click because we configured the system to pass through these events. So that's a malicious action in itself, but we can gain threat intelligence that's local to our organization from this particular event. For instance, we could assume that maybe this is not the only device that they have attacked, and maybe they will be using the same set of IP addresses to perform their attacks from or to connect back to. So what I can do is I can start looking in the recorded data for instances of this IP address, for instance. So I could take this and go to visibility, where we record all of the behavioral information from the endpoints and stream it into a large data lake, and then can start looking for it. So I can exclude the machine that we just had, like I can exclude it, for instance, by name, but I'm going to do it slightly differently. I can do search for things like process names. I can search for names of documents, registry keys, all sorts of artifacts or network connections. But right now, we already have this one breadcrumb, and that breadcrumb we have for our search is the IP address that we saw. So let's see if we can get more things that go to this particular destination IP from other systems, maybe. So this was a .2. And let's maybe search for 3 months or a whole year, or in our case, because we're doing a demo, just the last 24 hours. So I'm looking for something very simple. I'm looking for network connections now. And I see a lot of different network connections now, like there's 2,500 different network actions that I can see. And there's a lot of victim one in it. I already know that victim one was compromised, and I see that there's a destination port in it. I used 1337 in this case. So I have a lot of recordings, and I already know about this particular compromise because it wasn't a detection. Maybe I'm interested only in devices that are not this particular device. So open details. I get a lot of information about each individual network connection, like the process that did it. Maybe I'm interested only in connections that are not going to this destination port, but that are going to the same IP address. Or I'm interested only in things coming from not this particular system. So I can put this in a bag of query parameters and can add that to my query. So I create a new query. I'll say agent ID like this, and destination IP would be this one. And let's see if I can find anything. Actually, agent ID, not this. I want only other systems. So there's a query language. The query language uses auto-completion and makes it easy to formulate even complex queries, and then you can reuse and repeat them. And this is an example of a hypothesis that has no hits. So no, nobody is connecting to this particular IP address in my environment, which is great because now I know that in the period that I queried for, there have been no such connections, but maybe on the same subnet, there are connections like that. So I'm looking for connections to the same subnet, but not from this particular agent. And as I do this, I find two more machines in my environment that are doing connections to these, and they're doing them to standard ports, so to port 80. Possibly benign, maybe not benign, I don't know. So I probably want some context around it. So I go to this machine here and just pull up the context. And one of the things that we do is we automatically correlate all events that belong to the same line of actions, so the same storyline. So what I'm going to get back now is not just network connections, but I'm going to get back processes, URLs, and even the DLLs that were loaded in these processes. Now let's see what we found. We found a bunch of modules loaded. These are DLLs that were loaded. That's interesting, but more of forensic interest at a later stage in your investigation. We found processes that are related.
Jan, I had a question.
Sure.
So let's say now we saw the example of the machine of the attack happening, and we discovered that. Now, how quickly can you discover that? Because let's say as a company network, it didn't breach my system at all. It didn't show me that an attack took place. How long can I just continue with it without realizing that an attack has happened? Or in such a situation, how do you even realize that something like that's happened?
So I think the average from the Mandiant report that they do annually for average breach time differs across regions, but it's
Sure.
in excess, way in excess of 100 days typically. So very often things go unnoticed for a very prolonged period of time. If you're going low and slow and you're not trying to show that you are there, but you're intentionally working at the same working hours as your victims, you're using communications protocols that are not very chatty or noisy, like you're doing what this attacker did, use port 80, which is a regular web port, and do web communication there, then it's very likely that you will go undetected for prolonged periods of time. And that's really what threat hunting is for. It is to look for indications of behavior that are benign, or that could be benign, but that are in a gray area. So you can't just automatically stop all instances of that, because you would stop a lot of legitimate applications. That's why you do hunting for those. And going back a long period, is key to being able to then actually identify incidents from the past that you may not know about. So we see a lot of data that we found now, and it's easiest to make sense of the data by changing to a visual representation of what we just found. So we're now showing all of that contextual data we just found from victim 2, a different system that we haven't touched here, that had no detections, and that the only commonality is it is connected to port 80, so to the web port, in the same subnet as that system we had a detection from. And what we look at is we see a CMD that calls a PowerShell, and we look at the PowerShell command and we immediately see signs, or I don't even need to look what it does, but it says execution policy bypass, window hidden, and then it does things where it apparently retrieves a binary memory stream and then executes that. That's very clearly not great. That's very clearly malicious. So the next thing you would do is you would take this all, mark it as a threat, which turns it into a detection and then automatically responds to it and automatically contains the attack and remediates the actions. So what we saw is we went from having a detection, the detection was kind of noisy, that was a very obvious attacker behavior, to taking something we learned from that, turning that into a hypothesis. The hypothesis was there will be maybe other systems affected by the same threat actor, and then found instances of that we can now act on by marking as threat. So that's one way of showing the value of threat hunting. If you didn't record the data in the first place, then you wouldn't have the ability to respond to these incidents, and you would find out about them way later. That said, oh, sorry, Aki.
I was going to say we are almost running out of time, so maybe if you can just quickly take us through the challenges, and then we'll probably open the floor for questions.
Sure. So there are some core challenges in threat hunting, and whenever you talk to threat hunters, the first thing they tell you is they don't have enough data. I mean, you've seen that it takes a large data lake and a lot of data going back in order to be effective in threat hunting. I like to look at it from a slightly different angle, and that means that not enough data maybe means you don't have enough relevant data, you don't have enough signal. So just increasing the size of the haystack doesn't mean that you're going to have a better time finding the needle. Maybe you need a magnet. Maybe you need to have a better understanding of where the needle is going to be. And essentially, a lot of organizations have solved this problem by taking humans as the core means. And that means you have these raw events, you have a lot of them, you turn them into alerts automatically, and then you have humans that need to make sense of the alerts and that need to respond. So you have a digital problem, but you use humans to solve it, and the humans are necessarily a bottleneck. It even goes so far as to attackers using this to their advantage by just causing a lot of alerts, noisy behavior, and then hiding in the forest of detections, if you will. So I think you can look at this as a problem that is better solved with digital means, where you use machines for a longer part of that process. And that means the prioritization, the identification of incidents is handled for the most part by machines using machine learning and AI. And that's our approach. So we give you full visibility and threat hunting capability, but we pre-correlate events, look at indicators for behavior, and then bring them to your attention selectively. And that's shown in the MITRE testing as well. Like if you look at the recent wave of MITRE testing, then you'll see that we have done a tremendous job at being able to correlate automatically. So too much data is really what people typically have. They don't see the forest for the trees. Then not having enough capabilities is something you hear very often. Like we have this in our SOC, we have that other tool in our SOC. So what they're essentially saying is that when we need to respond, we have too many options and we don't know them in depth. And time is of the essence. There are some vendors that will talk about how you have 60 minutes to respond. I don't think that if we have an event like WannaCry again, that 60 minutes is going to be a wonderful time frame for you to respond. You want to be much faster than that, and you want to have controls at your disposal, like firewall management, like device management. You want to be able to maybe look at what else is on that same network, so you will have corresponding additional information, contextual information available. And having that spread across many different silos across the organization will make you a slow responder. So maybe you should focus on not creating too many options. Maybe you should focus on a vertically integrated approach. And another aspect and a challenge that we all feel every day is not having enough staff. And again, not having enough staff is saying, I need too much staff. So maybe the problem isn't just that you are having a difficult time finding the right staff and retaining that staff and training them. Maybe the problem is that because you're using 1,500 different tools and nobody knows them in depth, it's difficult to have enough people available that can respond in unison, in conjunction, in perfect orchestration when it's necessary. So that's something to think about for maybe looking at a vertically integrated approach that covers endpoint protection, device control, firewall control, all till threat hunting in one platform. And that's exactly what we do. So what we do is we have the core technology that you saw that correlates on the endpoint by following all of these different streams of actions that we call storylines or true context. Then tracking them until the point where we see a behavior that turns that particular storyline into a malicious storyline. And then we can not just determine the root cause, as you saw, we go back to the original document in the earlier case, but we can also mitigate automatically at machine speed. Like I went to manual mitigation, just clicking that button earlier, that's typically set to automatic for detections. So we can then surgically remove that storyline from the system and let everything else continue unharmed. So all the regular activity on the endpoint goes on as it should. And that's the core technology we have and the core value that we offer. And we package that in a platform called Singularity, where we have protection not just for servers and clients, but we have it for containerized cloud workloads as well, using the same behavioral analysis and true context technology and the automatic machine speed response with active EDR, and the threat hunting capability enabled by a large data lake that we make available to you for threat hunting, as we've just done. But we also make it available for you if you want to have access to the raw data. Artie, you asked earlier whether there was a way to like sift through the data yourself and consume it. We make that available to you so you can, if you wish to have the petabytes of behavioral information and create your own tooling on top of that, then that's something that you can do. And we contextualize it with information about IoT devices with Ranger. And in COVID-19 terms, that practically means that if you want to see the network environment in which your devices are currently in, like you want to know about that webcam that's on that same network or that Raspberry Pi that's popping up in your work environment or even on someone's home network, then you can with Ranger. And we supplement that with threat intelligence and managed detection and response services. But that's basically our story in a nutshell. I hope this was useful, and I'm looking forward to your questions. I hope I kept well of the time. It says 46 minutes for me. That's almost to the minute. So thank you very much.
Yes, I think we went a little over initially with the Q&As, a lot of questions. In fact, there's 4 of them pending now. We'll keep the floor, we'll get the floor open now for questions, any direct ones that you have. Just raise your hand and then I can unmute you. But in the meantime, Jan, there are like a few questions that are already here. Probably you can start with answering those. What should be the first steps that businesses in the region take when adopting cybersecurity? Do you see them taking the wrong steps, thinking they're covered only to be vulnerable later?
That's a very difficult question to answer for me. Like, what should be the first steps? I think every company will already have an existing cyber investment in one form or another. And it depends on the maturity of what you already have, what the best next step would be to invest in. Every company is facing challenges at the moment in terms of budget, in terms of income. At the same time, I would advise everyone to look not just for the crisis affecting your opportunities, but also for the opportunity in the crisis. Right now, you can push the big ideas. You can focus on big concepts as you rebuild for the post-COVID world and prepare for a changed way of doing business. So doing more strategic efforts than just doing tactical responding, which we've been doing probably until this day, and we're probably still in a tactical response phase. So you need to critically examine what you have. One good step could be to reduce the amount of tooling that you have in your environment and coalesce into one larger solution that is vertically integrated, as I'm a big proponent of. Another could be that you just have a tactical need that you need to solve in your particular environment. I don't think there's a blanket answer, unfortunately. I'm not the kind of person to give a blanket answer. Sorry.
Hope that answered the question. I think it did. I mean, I think it's hard to give a blanket answer. Another question which is here is, when hacking the machine on the public network, oh, this one was answered during your presentation.
Yeah.
Is there any data in the UAE MENA as to how many attacks there are? Also, how do attacks in the MENA region compare to other parts of the world? Are they higher, lower, etc.?
I would have to defer to my colleague Tamer for that. He will be more up to date on the current threat data in the region. What I've seen reported by customers is that charity scams around COVID are really prevalent in your region at the moment, and they're not super prevalent in my region, like where I'm situated. I'm currently in the middle of Europe, and that doesn't seem to affect people much here. But I don't have hard numbers for the current threat landscape in
So we can probably get those answered, and if you can just post the comment again, and we'll try and put that in the presentation and on our Facebook page as well. Another question that's come up is, what is a brute force attack and how can we prevent it?
A brute force attack is basically a relatively old style attack where you originally would just check for a known username. You would check passwords that are from a known password list. And that's not super effective against most organizations today, because they typically have complex passwords enabled. They typically have two-factor authentication. So you only have a handful of attempts in order to test a password. And very often you will have to present a proof of ownership for a physical device, like a token on a phone, for instance. However, they are very effective when you are using known password lists or known account lists that are coming from an earlier compromise. Like, we're using Zoom at the moment. Zoom recently had about 500,000 accounts that were compromised based on reuse of usernames and passwords that were already compromised in other services. So if you're using the same password that you use for one service with another service, that's a very bad practice, and that's something you should definitely change right now.
Another question, this is from Dimitris. Is the solution available on-prem on a secure isolated network? Does it need to be updated?
So yes, it's available for on-prem usage. So we have different levels of the product. This is not really a product presentation, so I'm not going through all of them right here. We have different levels that you can use, and up until control, you can use it on a secure isolated network. Does it need to be updated? Yes, but nowhere near to classical AV or typical EDRs, because it's not dependent on threat intel flowing in, but it acts by looking at behavior and correlating it. So typically for an on-prem solution, you're looking at updating it 2 times a year.
And I think we'll keep this as the last question. Can you please update us on the recently discovered security flaws on Apple iPhone's Mail app? We got a message from Etisalat to delete this app, but I use this daily, so should I remove it right away?
I cannot comment on that one, sorry.
No problem.
I have no information, good or bad, on that one.
But just as a broader question, when we hear news stories about flaws that are coming up, like for instance Zoom, or different apps where we see compromises that take place, there is an individual mindset, more on an individual level, on whether should I delete this app, will it compromise security, and also now that we're working out of home, will it compromise my company's security? So those are questions that come up. So what should people be doing? What should employees be doing?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, IT as a gatekeeper has historically made these choices for employees. And during COVID, we have seen that weakened, right? That organizational responsibility for IT has been kind of removed, and now end users have made a lot of the choices. I'll just use Zoom because it works. And I personally think Zoom works fantastically well.
Yeah.
However, the security issues they've had recently, one of them was very, very serious and could allow compromise of the local endpoint. So it could allow basically taking control of the device. They have fixed that, and they have fixed that actually in a good timeline. But still, there was a time when it maybe wasn't advisable to use the application, and you should definitely use the most updated version. As an end user, the best thing you can do is make sure you always run the latest version so that known vulnerabilities do not exist. And if IT has guidance, like IT may have instructed you to use Teams instead of Zoom, actually stick to it. I know that's hard in COVID times, but that's probably the best advice. There's not much you can do to teach an end user how to distinguish between the 5 different things that have been mentioned about Zoom in the news over the past few weeks, of which some has definitely just been fear, uncertainty, and doubt spreading in a situation where there's a battle for market share. But at least one of those vulnerabilities was very real, and some companies have responded to that by giving good guidance, like use Teams for the time being, etc. And that definitely was warranted at the time. So if you have an effective gatekeeper in your organization, make sure that your users listen to them.
Okay, perfect. I think with that, we'll come to an end today's session because we're a little bit over time. But thanks so much, Jan, for that session. It was very insightful. I hope it was beneficial to everybody else. Any other questions you have, feel free to send those across to us, and we'll try our best to get them answered. Any feedback you have as well. And you can access the presentation as well as the webinar on our website. We'll have it up quickly. Also, for the audience, any feedback you have, any other topics that you would like us to conduct webinars on, please share those with us, because we are all in a different situation right now, facing a different set of challenges. So any insights that you would like to gain access to, let us know, and do follow GB Gov Business on social. Thank you so much. Thank you once again, Jan, and have a great evening, everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to meeting you guys. Bye-bye.